With bouldering gaining so much popularity right now, some of you might want to test your skills out on the actual rock outside. Since going outside to boulder seems like a whole ordeal, I'm going to try and demystify what it takes to boulder outside for the first time. And I've made a pretty comprehensive list of everything you're going to need to know before you take your first trip. But as always, if you'd like to add something, if you think that I've missed something, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I will keep the description box updated with all of the new knowledge that we glean from the comment section. The first thing I'd like to talk about is all of the things that you're going to need to bring with you on your climbing trip. First things first, you're going to need shoes and chalk. If you're bouldering indoors already, you should probably already have these. I've seen a couple of people bring more than one pair of shoes outside because they want to have a good range of shoes for overhangs and slab, but since most of us, I think, maybe only have one pair of shoes in rotation, just bring what you have. That's what I do, and it's worked great for me so far. An unavoidable part of bouldering is the fall, and a crash pad is there to catch you when you do so. They come in a couple of varieties. I personally have the Metolius Difold. It's worked fine for me so far. It's a little small. You definitely want to bring at least one on your climbing trip, although it is preferable if you have multiple people going with you on your trip that more than one person brings a crash pad of their own. The more crash pads that you have, the more surface area that you have to cover the fall zone. One thing you'll notice is that outside, the rocks can be pretty sharp. Flappers or skin tears are going to be a little bit more common. If you'd like to keep climbing after you get one of these injuries, then it's advantageous to have tape on you. Just wrap that baby up in tape, keep climbing, you'll be good to go. On my first trip to Bishop, when I was at the Buttermilks, the rock there was so sharp that I actually taped every single one of my fingers in the most egregious form of aid bouldering known to man, a buddy. If you're going outside, bring a buddy with you to keep you company as well as keep you safe. If you have the option, I would definitely recommend going with a more experienced climber who is already familiar with the area that you're going to go to. Before your trip, either purchase or borrow a guidebook or download the Mountain Project app. That way you have a map of all the pertinent boulder problems and areas that you'd like to visit. I have personally found that Mountain Project has been sufficient for me, although I do think that the bouldering guidebooks maybe go a little bit more in depth and are a little easier to use. I'm assuming, I don't know. Is that true?
It depends.
If you're planning on going somewhere more regularly, then I would definitely check out the guidebook. But personally, I found that Mountain Project has been sufficient. All you need to do is before your trip, search the area and download all of the requisite information. That way you can access it in case your area has spotty cell service. A brush. A brush is essential to brush off any debris or choss off the rock before you're going to climb it, as well as clean up any excessive chalking or tick marks if you decide to do so when you are bouldering. You can get one from Amazon for like $10, so why not get one? Water and snacks. This one's kind of a no-brainer. If you especially forget water, you are in for a very bad time, my friend. Next, I'm going to talk about stuff that you should research before you go.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
Number one is definitely know how to spot before you go on your first trip. This is essential because you want the person on the rock to feel as comfortable as they can, knowing that if they fall, they're going to have a skillful spotter that will be able to catch them. I think the most important parts of spotting are reading where the person is likely to fall at any given point in the climb, being mindful of hazards, rocks, shrubs, etc., and know when to move the crash pad to cover the fall zone if it happens to move during the climb, which oftentimes does happen. Another important thing to know is where exactly to put the crash pad so that you cover up any potential hazards such as sharp rocks, etc. I think it's also worth communicating with the climber on how they'd like to be spotted. Just have a conversation with your climber, make sure that they know that they're going to be protected once they start climbing. Also keep in mind to read the environment, because depending on the environment, your type of spotting will be different. In some areas, you will need to force the climber to fall onto their crash pad, and in other times where the fall zone is pretty insured, pretty covered, you'll need to force your climber's head, maybe away from a rock that's nearby. Read the environment before you fall and take into account all potential hazards before anyone starts climbing. Next is check the weather and the conditions before you go. In California, at least, the climbing season is considered to be the colder months of the year, which also happens to be the wettest time of the year. Depending on the type of rock, especially sandstone, you do not want to be climbing for a couple of days after it has rained because this might damage the rock. We also had a couple of gnarly storms, and as such, roads to some of our local spots have been closed, so check the accessibility of your spot before you go if you suspect that there might be some closures. Next, plan for low cell service. This isn't going to be an issue everywhere, but making a plan with the group that you're going with to meet at a certain place at a certain time is really helpful. And I mean, I honestly don't think I have to say that much. You won't be able to depend on your phone to communicate if you're deep in the wild. The last thing I'm going to talk about is stuff to keep in mind when you are bouldering. When you are outdoors, you're finally there, you've made it. And the first thing I'd like to address is something that might come off as a little patronizing or preachy, but I feel like it's worth saying anyway. And what I'm talking about is practicing good climbing etiquette. First, you want to minimize your environmental impact, packing out all of your garbage that you might leave behind, maybe packing out some garbage that you see other people have left behind, and you also want to be mindful of local flora and fauna by staying on designated trails. Next, be considerate and mindful of others. You might be super stoked to climb outside and get rowdy, just like you're in the gym, but before you do so, I would read your environment, see if there are any climbers that might be within earshot of you. I'm not telling you that you should use your indoor voices and only communicate with your friends via whisper. I personally have not run into any issues with this, but I have talked to friends who have been a little bummed out because there are climbers who are being too obnoxious and a little too rowdy for them. So, something to keep in mind. Next is be mindful of the down climb. After all that, you've made it, you've topped out of your first project, and then you realize, oh no, how do I get down from here? Especially if you're starting out, the route that you just climbed up might actually be the down climb. And oftentimes going down your problem is more difficult than going up. And so this is where having a buddy really comes in handy because they'll be able to coach you down and spot you if you need to take a jump. The last thing I'm gonna say, and the thing you probably hear most about climbing outside, is that it is a totally different game than climbing inside. Indoor gyms tend to inflate their lower grades, so don't be surprised if you can only climb V0s and V1s outside if you're climbing V3 and V4 in your gym, which is what my level was at when I started bouldering outside. The rock will feel totally different than your plastic holds inside, and you might experience a mental block and get a little too spooked if you're high up on a boulder problem, but just throw yourself on as much stuff as you can, tick off as many low-grade climbs as possible, go a couple of times to get used to the feel of the rock, and try a couple of times before you give up on the outdoors completely. The first couple of times that I bouldered outside, I got really discouraged because, like I said, I was only climbing V0s to V2s. I equated my self-worth as a boulderer to the maximum grade I could boulder outside. And aren't we all just supposed to have fun? Those are all my tips for any beginner boulderer to start bouldering outside. If you go outside in the future, take a photo, a video of yourself climbing, follow @JenSens on Instagram. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you guys are up to, and until then, I'll see you later. All right.